To live as a human being is to inhabit a story that we are constantly telling ourselves, a narrative where we are the main character navigating a world of objects and others. Most of our days are spent protecting this character, polishing its image, and defending its territory against the perceived threats of life. Yet, beneath the surface of this activity, there is a quiet question that often goes unasked. Who is the one living this story? The Buddha suggested that our deepest suffering arises from a fundamental misunderstanding of our own identity, a mistake that leads us to believe in a permanent, separate, and solid self. By understanding the teaching of Anatta, or non-self, we begin to cultivate the highest wisdom that allows us to see through the illusion of the ego. This is not a philosophy of loss, but a pathway to a resilience and clarity that can weather any storm. To understand why the sense of a solid self is so convincing, we must first look at the biological and historical forces that shaped our minds over millions of years. From the perspective of our ancestors, having a strong sense of ownership over one's body and resources was a vital necessity for staying alive. Nature did not care about our philosophical enlightenment. It cared only about our survival and the continuation of our genetic lineage. The brain evolved as a sophisticated prediction machine, designed to keep this physical vessel safe in a world of predators and scarcity. This required the creation of a central command center, a psychological focal point that we now call the ego. This ego acts like a security guard, constantly scanning the environment for threats and opportunities, always asking how any given event will affect me or mine. Because this mechanism was so successful at keeping us alive, it became deeply embedded in our consciousness, creating a feeling of a solid owner who resides somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears. We feel like a permanent entity that possesses thoughts, experiences, feelings, and makes decisions. However, this sense of being a fixed controller is actually a biological illusion, a trick played by evolution to ensure that we prioritize our own survival over the rest of the world. When we look at the modern landscape, we see this ancient survival drive manifesting in our obsession with status, our fear of being forgotten, and our desperate need to define ourselves through labels and possessions. We build an elaborate fortress around this perceived self. Yet the more we try to solidify it, the more anxious and isolated we become. The root of our modern stress is often found in this prehistoric software that is still running in the background of our minds. We are trying to protect a ghost that was never there to begin with. This biological self-centeredness was once a shield, but in a world that requires connection and adaptability, it often becomes a cage. The Buddha did not ask us to hate this ego or to try to destroy it with force, but rather to see it clearly for what it is. He wanted us to recognize that this feeling of a solid self is a composite process, a collection of habits and reactions that have no enduring core. When we look deeply into the root of our identity, we find that there is no manager in the office. There is only the office itself, functioning through a series of complex and interconnected causes and conditions. By acknowledging that the ego is a tool for survival rather than the ultimate truth of our being, we can begin to relax the grip of self-clinging. We can start to see that our anger, our pride, and our deepest insecurities are not personal failings, but are simply the echoes of an ancient biological drive that we can learn to observe without being controlled by it. This is the first step toward a calm and unshakable mind, moving from the reactive state of the animal to the reflective state of a conscious human being. It is a journey of unlearning the habits of a million years in order to find a peace that is not dependent on the ego's success. If we look at our direct experience right now, we can begin to dismantle the illusion of the self by analyzing the different layers of our existence. Think of the body, which we often refer to as my body, as if there were a separate owner who possesses it. In reality, the body is a flowing river of biological processes, composed of elements that were once part of the earth, the water, and the air. Every 7 years, almost every cell in the body is replaced. Yet we cling to the idea that there is a permanent physical self. When we move from the physical to the mental, the illusion becomes even more transparent. Consider our feelings and sensations. A pleasant feeling arises, stays for a moment, and then fades away, followed by an unpleasant sensation, or perhaps a neutral one. None of these feelings are permanent, and none of them can be controlled by our will. We do not choose to feel hungry or tired or joyful. These states arise due to conditions. If they were truly our self, we would be able to command them to stay forever or to never appear at all. The same logic applies to our perceptions, our mental formations, and even our consciousness itself. We often think of our consciousness as a stable screen upon which the movie of life is projected. But if we look closely, we see that consciousness is also a series of moments. There is eye consciousness when we see a flower, ear consciousness when we hear a bird, and mind consciousness when we think a thought. These are discrete events that flash in and out of existence like the frames of a film. Because they happen so quickly, they create the appearance of a continuous self, much like how a spinning torch creates the illusion of a solid circle of fire. This fundamental law of impermanence is the key to understanding non-self. Everything we identify as me is actually a temporary configuration of energy and information. When we analyze our thoughts, we find that they are like clouds passing through an open sky. They appear from nowhere, linger for a few seconds, and dissolve. We are not the author of our thoughts. We are the space in which they happen. If we were the author, we would never choose to have a thought that causes us pain or anxiety. By breaking down our experience into these changing parts, we see that there is no core at the center of the onion. We peel away the body, the feelings, the memories, and the labels, and we find that there is no permanent soul or ego hiding underneath. This realization is not meant to be frightening. It is meant to be liberating. If there is no fixed self, then we are not stuck with our past mistakes or our current limitations. We are a fluid process that can be transformed through new conditions and new choices. We are like a flame that is passed from one candle to another. The flame is not the same flame, yet it is not a different flame either. It is a continuation of energy. When we stop trying to find a solid point to stand on in the middle of a flowing river, we finally learn how to swim. This analysis allows us to look directly into reality without the distortion of our ego-driven preferences. We begin to see things as they truly are, rather than as we want them to be. This clarity is the foundation of a resilient mind, because it removes the target that life usually hits. When there is no solid self to be insulted, no permanent ego to be threatened, and no fixed identity to be lost, we become truly unshakable. We live in a culture that is obsessed with the construction and maintenance of a personal identity, a world where we are constantly encouraged to stand out, to be someone, and to broadcast our unique brand to the collective. From a young age, we are taught that our value is tied to the strength and distinctness of our ego. We spend decades accumulating credentials, building a specific image, and curating a history that we call my life. This cultural pressure creates a state of chronic hypervigilance. as we must constantly defend this fragile identity against any form of criticism or perceived failure. If someone disagrees with us, we feel it as a personal attack on our very existence. If we lose our job or our status, we feel as though we have literally become less of a person. This is the heavy price we pay for clinging to the illusion of a solid and permanent self. When we look at the high rates of anxiety and depression in our modern era, we can see the footprint of an exhausted ego. It is a weary ghost trying to hold up a mountain. We are told that the path to happiness is to improve the self, to fix the self, or to find a more authentic self. But all of these efforts only serve to reinforce the original mistake. They keep us trapped in the same loop of seeking and wanting, because the self we are trying to fix is a shifting shadow that cannot be grasped. The Buddha's insight into non-self challenges this entire framework by suggesting that the most profound healing comes not from perfecting the ego, but from seeing through it. When we realize that our identity is a story rather than a substance, we are no longer at the mercy of every passing event. We can lose our possessions, our beauty, and our reputation, yet the awareness that observes these changes remains untouched. Most of our social conflicts arise from two or more egos colliding, each trying to prove its own validity and importance. We fight over ideas, over space, and over recognition, all because we are terrified that if we are not right, or if we are not seen, we might cease to exist. But the truth of non-self tells us that we have never been that narrow definition of a person. We are a vast, interconnected process of life itself. By dropping the heavy armor of the self, we do not become nothing. We become everything. We find a new kind of strength that does not need to shout or dominate. It is the strength of the water that flows around obstacles rather than the stone that breaks against them. To let go of the self is not an act of self-destruction. It is an act of total honesty. It is acknowledging that we are part of an infinite web of life where nothing is separate and nothing is fixed. In this understanding, the frantic need for validation begins to dissolve, replaced by a quiet and steady confidence that is not shaken by the changing winds of the world. The application of this wisdom in our daily lives does not mean we stop functioning in the world or that we lose our ability to care for ourselves and others. Instead, it changes the quality of our actions and the depth of our relationships. When we work from a place of non-self, we are no longer doing it to feed our vanity or to secure our future against an imaginary threat. We work because it is what needs to be done, because we want to contribute to the well-being of the whole, and because the act of creation itself is intrinsically satisfying. We become more efficient and more creative because our energy is no longer being drained by the constant maintenance of our ego. We are free to fail because our worth is not tied to the outcome. We are free to succeed without becoming arrogant, because we know that our success is the result of 1,000 different conditions beyond our control. In our relationships, the understanding of non-self allows us to truly see the other person for who they are, rather than as a mirror for our own needs or a character in our personal drama. We can love more deeply because we are not trying to own the other person or use them to complete our own sense of self. Compassion becomes a natural response rather than a moral duty. When we see that the other person is also a flow of changing parts, struggling with their own biological drives and cultural conditioning, our judgment softens and our empathy expands. We recognize that their suffering is not different from our suffering. This is the ultimate liberation that the Buddha spoke of. A freedom from the prison of the individual ego that allows us to walk through the world with light footsteps. This perspective also transforms how we handle the inevitable difficulties of life. such as sickness, aging, and loss. Usually, when the body fails, we feel betrayed. When we lose a loved one, we feel as though a piece of ourselves has been torn away. But if we have integrated the wisdom of non-self, we see these events as the natural unfolding of reality. The body is doing what bodies do, and life is flowing as it always has. We can grieve without being destroyed by our grief, and we can experience pain without turning it into a narrative of personal victimhood. This is the highest wisdom because it is the only one that can provide a peace that does not depend on things going our way. It is a resilience that is built on the truth of how things are, rather than on the fragile hope of how we want them to be. To practice this in everyday life, we simply need to observe the movements of our own mind. When we feel a surge of pride, we note it as just a thought. When we feel a pang of jealousy, we see it as a biological reaction. We do not need to fight these feelings. We only need to stop identifying with them. In that space of non-identification, there is a profound stillness and a vast clarity that has always been there, waiting for us to stop being so busy with ourself. Understanding non-self is not a one-time intellectual realization, but a lifelong practice of gentle observation. It is the gradual thinning of the veil that separates us from the truth of our existence. As the ego becomes more transparent, the world becomes more vibrant, more intimate, and more sacred. We no longer feel like a small, separate entity struggling against a vast and indifferent universe. Instead, we feel like the universe itself experiencing one of its many forms. This is the highest wisdom, the ultimate comfort, and the greatest source of awareness that a human being can attain. To live without the burden of a solid self is to finally walk in freedom, knowing that we are both nothing and everything at the same time.